So now it's my pleasure to introduce Stephen Pruitt. Stephen is, let me get his title right here, he's Vice President for Content, Research and Development for Chief. But you can really look at his bio in your books. So if you're looking for books, I think it's like the third handout in there. There's a little bio of all of us who are in there, so you can look at that bio. I'm actually just going to point out a couple of highlights about Steve. First, interesting enough, he was also a chemistry teacher. I always like meeting former chemistry teachers. We have this sort of connection. We have the smell of the lab sort of in our veins. So that's one important thing about a chief, but about Stephen. But I've known Stephen now for 4 years. First 2 years when we worked on the framework for K-12 science education, and then as Steve led the effort for developing the next generation of science standards. And what I found really impressive about Steve is how he could just work with a great variety of people and take into consideration their points of view. It's a real unique effort to try to work with 26 states, for instance. How do you possibly do that? I find it challenging to work with one, but Steve was actually able to work with 26 states to really try to move these new standards for our nation forward. So with that, it's my pleasure, and I'm really happy that Stephen could join us today. So Stephen.
So what I didn't tell you is I am from Georgia. Those of you who have heard me before, sorry. Those of you who haven't, you'll figure it out, listen slowly, and come. I'm so very happy to be here today. This is just one of the coolest things I have been to in a very long time. It's awesome to have 800 people. Of course, the teacher in me also realizes that being stationary here means you're checking your BlackBerries over there. But hopefully we can keep you a little bit entertained and also hopefully go through and answer some questions for you. There's a lot of well thought out breakout sessions that you're going to be able to experience later today that you can get more questions answered. But before we kind of get into all that, just for my own benefit, I'd like to do a couple of things. If you are a classroom teacher, K-12, could you raise your hand? Just like, wow, that's incredible. If you're an administrator in K-12, could you raise your hand? Excellent, excellent. If you're at the district office, or county office, whatever you call them here in Michigan, great. Higher ed, excellent. Business, partners, STEM, excellent. So that's fantastic. I just really appreciate you giving up your day to come and be with us. Now, before I really get into my presentation, I'd also like to just do a little bit of recognition myself. This whole process has been, from the very beginning, we really wanted something that was going to be transparent and robust. And at the end, we wanted people to be able to say that they really were able to shape the document. So if I could, I'd like to ask the Michigan, I'm not sure what you ended up calling them, Sue, the leadership team, the internal review team for Michigan that helped give feedback to MDE and then ultimately to the standards. Could you stand for a second, just so people can see you? And then stay standing. Excellent. And thank you for your support in this. That's it. I'd like to ask anybody in the room who submitted feedback through the website, to their district, to their professional organization, anything that ended up funneling to the standards, could you also stand? That's fantastic. This is why these are Michigan state standards. Because Michigan really took a bold step in being a part of this. And there were so many people who were involved in this whole process that really helped drive what are the next generation science standards and that maybe someday will be the Michigan state science standards. So let me start by Now, I know some of you have heard me before. You've you know, come to an STA, you've watched me on YouTube, which just scares the heck out of me. I was testifying at a state legislature, and the guy, the chair of the education committee said, "I watched you on YouTube last night." My first thought was, "Oh, God, what was on there?" You know, and luckily it was a presentation I gave. And then for some of you, you've read entire transcripts of my speech just by following Jen on Twitter. What I'd like to do is I'm going to start by just kind of recapping the process a little bit, and then I want to spend some real time talking about what I call conceptual shift, but you call conceptual focus here in Michigan. And I'm going to spend a little time about that. Then and that's going to kind of give you a big picture view. Now, I realize that there are a lot of people in the room who will know a lot of the stuff I talked about today. But what I've found is, unfortunately, I can't start with that assumption. We actually have to go through a little bit to make sure people are at least to the same 30,000 foot level. And then when Joe comes up a little bit, we'll do some things that are a little bit more granular. And then, of course, when you go to the breakout, you'll have a great opportunity to really talk about some of these things in depth. So, first of all, you know that every state standard, all 50, come from one of the two documents on the screen. Okay, now, a lot of people I have found thought, well, that was kind of a failed initiative because you had these two sets of documents, but nobody really adopted them. Well, the reality is that they were never really meant to be adopted. They were meant to guide the development of state standards, because state standards, at the end of the day, are student outcomes. And these were the content. And they talked about inquiry, and they talked about all those other things, but they didn't really talk about how to really put those into place. The other part that was a little bit tough was you had two organizations that kind of spoke for the scientific community. You had the American Association for Advancement of Science, AAAS, and you had the National Research Council, NRC. I was the state science supervisor in Georgia, and when we did our standards back in 2004, you know what you do is you pick one of the documents as your base documents, and then you fill in the gaps with the other. Well, you know what happens when you do that? Everything in the world ends up in your standards, and then you combine that with the fact that every state kind of had a different expectation of what they wanted their kids to be able to do. And there were some states that really said, "Hey, we want our kids to really be thoughtful and think through things and do things," and you had others that said if they can spell mitosis, we're probably good. You know, and so you ended up with this really big difference here in how the 50 states handle it. Well, since then, we've learned a lot more about how kids learn. There's been a lot of research around cognitive science, learning progressions, ready, set science, taking science to school. So we know a lot more about when kids can learn things and how they learn things. So what happened then was there was this two-step process that was funded by the Carnegie Corporation in New York. Now, for any of you who, you might have a tendency to listen to a lot of political rhetoric or you read blogs or whatever, let me just say to you, number one, there was a reason we didn't call these Common Core, because the process was actually very different. And this first step that we'll talk about is one of those. But the other thing is, Carnegie Corporation put money in to do this. It was privately funded. There was some also additional money from the Noyce Foundation and from Cisco and some different groups, but nothing federal. There was nothing that the feds put money into this, and there's no race to the top coming for science. So there's no carrot, so to speak, no incentive for people to do this, which actually, to be honest with you, when we ended up with 26 states as leads, we were all a little surprised. Originally, like Joe said, we were going to have 6. And I actually had people inside the Beltway in D.C. say, "Do you think you'll get 6 applications?" I mean, Stephen, it's science. That scares people. And then we ended up with 20. And then we took them all, because they were all great applications. And then we had people say, "Well, if we'd known you were going to take everybody, we would have applied too." So we opened it back up for them. So this whole idea of this state-led idea was big. But when Carnegie envisioned this process, they envisioned a two-step process. And the first one was with the framework. Now, folks, if you haven't read the framework, the stuff that we're trying to do with NGSS is going to be tough. Because I'm going to tell you, it's tough even if you've read the framework. I have lived and breathed and ate and drank, sometimes wanted to drink a lot around this process, okay? And I still, even now, will learn things. And I'll go, wow, I hadn't thought about that. But if you haven't read this document at all, you really need to. And if you don't have time to read the whole thing, at the very least, read the vision for where we want to go. Because what this framework does is it lays out not just the content that people should know, the kids should know as they graduate, but also the vision for where science education should go. It was a great committee. The first thing to note is it was a partnership with the National Research Council, AAAS, NSTA, and Achieve. Now, so we go from the two voices in the top left to a single voice. It was mainly focused on, there were 18 individuals who sat on this committee, this consensus committee from the NRC that really helped form this. And 17 of them were brilliant. The 18th one was the token Southerner who had to sit on the committee. That was me. It's okay to laugh at that. And so it was really impressive. I mean, I was in the middle of my dissertation when I was on it. I was just starstruck. I felt like I needed to have people sign, a play card for me. I mean, it was Joe. I got to sit next to Joe the first day. I was like, oh, this is Joe Granger. I just quoted him in my dissertation. And I looked across the way, and there's David Hirschbeck, who got a Nobel Prize in chemistry in 1986, being a chemist. Wow. In fact, it was really great. Not too long after we started this, there was a Simpsons episode where Homer won the Nobel Prize. That's not the funny part. And Dudley Hirschbeck walks out on stage to give him the prize. And I'm like, oh, I know somebody that's animated. So I'm sitting there with my son and I'm going, Samuel, I know him. I work on a committee with him. And without missing a beat, my son said, Dad, Homer's not real. So this really lays out the vision for where we should go. So now we've just finished up the last part of this, which is the development of the actual next generation science standards. And now they're out for public review, for states to review. This is a totally up to states as to what they do with them at this point. We had one state that adopted last week. The first state that adopted them was Rhode Island. Some of you may have heard that already by unanimous vote. And we've got a lot of states. We've got about 10 states who have introduced it to their state board in some way. So now we're at that part where people have to start making decisions. And some of that decision may be, we're not going to do it. That's their prerogative. Other states are going to say, let's do it, let's go forward and do some great things. So it's up to them. This is not something that anybody's pushing on them. It's just there for people to consider. Now, I will say, in a lot of states, they should consider at least some kind of revision. If they're still talking about 9 planets, if they're still talking about 3 kingdoms, they might want to think about coming into the 21st century. Of course, if they're talking about 3 kingdoms, they probably should think about coming into the 20th century. Now, I'm going to spend some time going through these conceptual shifts. Now, here's the thing. What's great about this gathering and the way it's been thought out is that you come to learn more. And you come to learn sort of from the horse's mouth. The people who really worked on this in Michigan. And that's great. Because I hear all the time and I read on blogs and Twitters all the time about people who get kind of a piece of information, but they don't really know the whole story. Kind of reminds me, we had this little diner. I'm not making fun of Twitter, Jen. It kind of reminds me of, we had this little diner in my hometown where I grew up, and the owner decided he was going to have one of those little giveaways, how you peel the thing off the Coke cup at McDonald's or whatever. And so we had this lady named Mabel. You can imagine in Georgia, there's a lot of people named Mabel. And to be honest with you, her name was Mabel Blue, but we all just said Mabel. And so Mabel just goes into hysterics about she's won an RV. She's won an RV. She's so excited. And the guy comes out and says, Mabel, there's nothing that big on those cups. She's like, it does. It says it right here. He said, let me see it. He says, Mabel, it says, win a bagel. Not a bagel. Now, the reason for that story is because people hear parts of things. And so you've got a real opportunity here, and I hope that you'll take the opportunity to ask questions of the facilitators, of Sue, of me. I'm actually here all day, which is actually great because I don't always get the opportunity to do that. So I'm here. Please, nobody call me anything but Stephen. Well, I used to work in state government. I mean, let's face it. You're happy if people call you by your name. It's not got 4 letters in it. So anyway, so we have 7 real shifts or foci that we talk about. And so the first thing I'd like to talk about is the interconnected nature of science. These standards are going to look very different. If you've not had an opportunity to see these yet, or if you've only seen them a little bit, they look a lot different than what you typically see. They are really something that requires performance as opposed to students engaging in what I call intellectual bulimia. Binging on lots of facts and yakking that up on test day and walking away with a bad taste in their mouth for science. So, there are 3 dimensions. There are science and engineering practices, there are cross-cutting concepts, and there are disciplinary core ideas. Practices are how scientists accumulate and disseminate knowledge. It's the ability to ask questions, to construct explanations, to construct and use models, to use investigations, and they're all very interconnected. These are the things that are what we have always talked about as inquiry. The biggest problem with the word inquiry was that it hit our lexicon. When a word hits the education lexicon, it's kind of done. Because it kind of loses some meaning. We had people who said, I've done a lab, therefore I've done inquiry. We had other people that said, okay, children, everything's on the table. We want you to learn everything that every scientist has ever learned in the next 45 minutes. Try not to kill or maim yourself or others. And so what did it mean? Well, the whole idea behind these 8 practices is it's really unpacked what inquiry means. By the way, if you're playing education bingo, you can put a bingo card down by unpacked, because you are required to say the word unpacked in every education speech. The disciplinary core ideas, that's the stuff, that's the content. It's the understanding that kids need to have. Cross-cutting concepts are how things actually come together. And that maybe we start to help kids realize that when I learned about matter and energy in biology, it's actually the same matter and energy in chemistry and physics. Different lens, different perspective, but matter is matter. So it's really this whole idea of bringing these things together, because scientists don't walk into their labs on Monday and think about just practices. They don't walk in on Tuesday and think about just content. We've actually sent some strong messages to the publishers already that they've got to find a new chapter 1. Okay, everybody knows what chapter 1 is. Scientific method. It's a myth. That's why I call it that, because I've never known a scientist that walked into their lab and said, today, I shall state a problem. Next, I will write a hypothesis and then construct an investigation. That's not how scientists work. These standards are really about, they have to be about what? They have to be about the rigorous content, but they're also about the how and the why. I read recently where there was a survey done in the U.S. that asked people about the sun, moon, earth model. And that only 80% of our country knew that the earth orbited the sun and the moon orbited the earth. Now that's pretty sad that there's only 80% of people knew that. But wait, it gets worse. When you say, how do you know that? It dropped to 49%. So the hows and the whys have become lost. in a sea of facts. So it really, this interconnectedness is there to create perspective and context. This is not new. This is actually going on in other initiatives, and this is actually something that's coming a little bit late to the party. If you're an AP Bio teacher, you've already seen it in your classrooms in AP Biology, where performance expectations, the combining of practice and content. You'll see that there are actually a couple of undergraduate biology initiatives underway to do the same thing. The new PISA assessment in 2015 is based on performance expectations, the blending of the dimensions. And even the future Scientific Foundations for Future Physicians is redoing their standards to be more reflective. Maybe it's important not just that you know where the appendix is, but you also know how to take it out. We know this approach works because it actually is founded in research. There's a great deal of research here around how this works and that it does work. So I already hear people saying, we don't know if these will work. They've not been tested. They've not been piloted. This methodology has. It actually has a substantial amount of research behind it. America's Lab Report, for instance, had the goals of increasing mastery, developing reasoning, understanding empirical work, and developing practical skills, and interest in science and science learning. But what they found when they did their study was there was a significant number of kids who just weren't getting this type of instruction. Now, I want to be really clear about something. I really believe with every fiber of my being that everything in the NGSS, from a vision perspective, is being done across this country by great teachers. Teachers, I think, in the U.S. are the most innovative and fantastic professionals there are. But the issue is it's not being done consistently for all kids across all of our states. So this idea is something that we have to, that is meant to perturb the system enough to create change. The second focus is that these are performance expectations, not curriculum. Performances. Kids have to perform. Now it's not about what the teacher covered, it's about the fact that kids actually have to show that they have understanding. They actually have to show evidence. So what are standards? They are meant to show a clear vision of learning. They are articulating the student performance at the conclusion of instruction. That means that basically these are what kids are assessed on. You will not take a PE and teach the PE. If you do, you've missed the point. Okay? The idea is, well, how do we get kids to be able to perform these? They are not a description of curriculum. They don't dictate instruction. In fact, you'll see coming out in the next couple of weeks, one particular organization is going to come out and they're going to refer to these as tasks. They're not tasks. Tasks will tell you exactly. Students will create a factory on the river, on the banks of Crystal River in Florida, which is next to a manatee preserve. Students will do blah, blah, blah. That's a task. When a student is asked to construct a model that supports the explanation that matter is changed in a chemical reaction but is conserved overall, that is an understanding. That is a performance that they have to do. When you think about it, you have to think about the performance expectation as what you build toward. So people say, I've already heard people say this, it's going to limit what I can do as a teacher. Actually, no. It should greatly enhance what you do as a teacher. So what's not there are you get to choose what kinds of evidence you're going to help these kids build. So you don't have to learn every sex-linked trait to understand that genes pass from generation to generation. Okay? You don't have to deal with every piece of every ecosystem. What you want to do is you actually get the flexibility to make a lot of instructional choices. And you build toward these expectations as opposed to that being your learning goal for the day. So here's this is an example. This actually will be coming out this week. This is in one of our case studies for all standards, all students. And so what I want to walk you through here is just, this is how you might construct instruction around these two performance expectations. Now the first thing I want everybody to hear, and you'll hear it a lot today, is the word bundling. If you go into this thinking, oh, there are 25 performance expectations in my grade, 25 divided by the number of days I have, You've missed the point. These things have been developed intentionally to be very interconnected. If they're taught in pieces, what you get is what I call limiting snippet science. Okay? A series of unfortunate events. It's not coherent and it doesn't really blend itself. So this is a snapshot. Okay? So there's just two that will be shown here. But what we're going to do is I'm going to walk you through, this is how you could consider this. Now here's the other thing people are going to say. Notice that there's always a practice associated with a piece of content. That's not the only practice you'll ever use. Number one, it's not the intention, but number two, I really don't know how you could do that. Because I hear people say, oh, you've moved away from lab science. Because you don't say do an investigation all the time. Well, you know, if you're doing an explanation or you're doing an argument where you have to build evidence, what's a great way to do that? Through a lab. If you're doing a model, you can actually collect that data through a lab. It actually creates a lot of flexibility for you. So first of all, in this case, students are going to be asked to evaluate a video that shows a tanker dramatically imploding the day after being washed out with steam, and then all the ports were closed. Kids, the understanding from the content perspective is that they are going to understand that in a gas, they are widely spaced except for when they happen to collide. The changes in state occur within variations of pressure, and that can be described. And students specifically are going to discuss spacing of molecules in liquid and gas phases. So here's a shift. Instead of kids just talking about Boyle's Law, Charles' Law, you can still do, but they're going to talk about the reason pressure acts the way it does, and it's actually about spacing of molecules. It's a much different way of thinking. Again, this is a middle school example. Notice that they're using obtaining, evaluating, communicating information. And people go, wait, that's not one of the practices up at the top. No, but what a great way to engage kids in getting them started. Well, then the teacher is going to have them develop and use a model. They're going to decide, they're going to all create models, they're going to get into groups, and they're going to decide on which one is the best. Again, the content here is focused on spacing the molecules. So the model itself is going to have to describe, through drawings, the molecules and the force of atoms. Then they're going to revise their models. See, we all have models in our schools right now. I bet all of you right now have models in your schools. And I bet most of them are edible. You know, we love Jell-O molds of a cell, we love, you know, all those sorts of things. There's nothing wrong with that. But what gets lost with models is revision, right? So here they're going to revise it. How are they going to do that? Well, the teacher is going to lecture a little bit about pressure. Now, see, here's another thing people get a misconception on that, because we talk about the practices. Are there still going to be things you as a teacher have to tell your kids? Yes. Okay, so the teacher's going to talk about pressure. They're going to do some examples and maybe do some demos. They're going to talk about those relationships of pressure, volume, and temperature. And they're going to apply the understanding of internal and external pressure. Because kids just see pressure. Now you want to start bringing in this idea that there's actually a relationship between things inside and things outside. Now, all along, the cross-cutting concept here is cause and effect. Kids are looking for the relationship of cause and effect here. They're also talking constantly about matter. And then we're going to bring the energy aspect in. So now they're going to construct an explanation. They're going to do the old Coke can. You know, the imploding Coke can, flip it over. And now they're going to take that and they're going to say, well, that has something to do with temperature. So let's start talking about energy and how energy actually impacts the spacing of the molecules. Then they're going to actually engage in argument and evidence. So this is going to be the culminating experience. The teacher gives them a new and unique situation. They explain about blimps, and that there's this bladder inside a blimp. And from an engineering perspective, why is that important, and how does that relate to spacing the molecules, to energy, to temperature? How does that actually cause the thing to ultimately float? And kids have to take all of that and construct an argument about how that works. When a kid goes through all of those steps, will they be able to develop a model that predicts and describes changes in atomic motion, temperature, and states of pure substances? Probably. Will we need to go back and visit this in another time? Yes. Because here's the thing. When you start thinking about instruction, you'll hear this a lot today. We can't think about lesson plans first. We have to think about an overall plan, instructional plan, and then how you build toward that. Again, focusing on cross-cutting concepts of cause and effect matter in energy. Now, the next instructional shift is that science concepts build coherently across K-12. Now, in Georgia, we used to have that whole idea, where you teach the same thing every year, and every year is supposed to get more rigorous, and that's not what we're talking about here. Okay, we're actually talking about knowledge building. And I used to joke in Georgia that, in kindergarten, we kill bean seeds every year. And you take the bean seed, put it in a wet paper towel, put it in the window. And then in first grade, you did the same thing, but to increase rigor, the kid got to wet their own paper towel. And in second grade, they got dirt. And so that's not what we mean here. What we're talking about here is a real change in the cognitive understanding and cognitive sophistication. One of the appendices that David will talk about in his sessions is the progression idea. That there is actually a progression of understanding. That's really important because it means everybody has a job to do. It means we can't leave stuff out. Okay? Now, everybody automatically assumes here that I'm talking about elementary, we don't teach enough science, and you know what? We need to teach more science and all that. But actually, everybody, so you high school folks, don't think you're off the hook. Because I got news for you. Earth understanding doesn't stop after you turn 14. Okay, you actually have to understand something about the earth you live on and live in after you turn 14. So there's actually this whole idea of this learning that happens across time. So you can go and see this in Dave's session, you can go to the appendix and see it. But the issue is that there's actually specific things that kids learn in each of the grade bands. Now, these boxes here, these actually come from this chart. Okay, so the fact that matter is composed of atoms, molecules can be used to explain the properties of substances. That is an understanding. That is what kids should learn in middle school about matter. Okay, or one of the things they should learn about matter. The other one here is reacting substances rearranged to form different molecules, but the number of atoms is conserved. Some reactants release energy and others absorb energy. These two things were guiding principles when the standards were being developed. And all the performance expectations lead to those. But here's what I was talking about earlier about the bundling issue. The fact is that if we did our job well, and personally I think that the writing team in the States did a great job of ensuring that there was this constant connection. This performance expectation says analyze and interpret data on the properties of substances before and after the substances interact to determine if chemical reactions occur. To do that, don't you have to know that atoms rearrange? Because that's where the properties are going to be. Well, also this one here. Develop and use a model to describe how the total number of atoms does not change in a chemical reaction and thus mass is conserved. How can you do that if you don't understand that matter is made of particles? So I hear people a lot say, oh, well, we don't tell people to balance equations. Well, you could balance equations here. But if all you do is balance equations, you don't help kids see that the reason we balance equations, the reason we do stoichiometry, I mean, I love the word. I'm telling you. You know, it got me out of so much stuff when I was at the State Department of Education, because I could be testifying in front of the state board and I could just say the word stoichiometry and they would dismiss me. You know? But the reality is when it's just the math or it's just that model and we don't really get into why this works, that's where we lose kids. We also have a progression for science and engineering practices because the way a kid asks questions in K2 looks very different than how they do in high school. Same thing with cross-cutting concepts. How does that focus change across time? Deeper understanding of content. It's not just about the stuff, it's about how and why. So here's an existing state standard. It's not Michigan, so nobody start looking for it. But remember that little example I gave earlier about the Earth, Sun, Moon system? Well, in third grade in this state, students know the way in which moon appearances change during the 4-week cycle. So they're going to learn waxing, waning, and I got to be honest with you, I can never remember which one's which. And I consider myself a fairly fully functioning adult. You know, now I can tell you where the sun, moon, and earth are in relation to one another, which I actually think is a little bit more important. But these third graders are going to be able to take the Oreo, you know, scrape the stuff off, which is a great example, by the way, because we know that that's how the moon changes and scrape stuff off. Students know that Earth is one of several planets that orbit the sun and the moon orbits the Earth. So they're going to know that. It's just like, you know, people say, well, why don't kids learn about atoms in elementary school? Because they're going to hear it on cartoons. They are, and they're going to know it. But what are they going to know about it? How are they going to know it? In 5th grade, students know the solar system includes the planet Earth, the moon, the sun, and 8 other planets and their satellites and smaller objects such as asteroids and comets. So they're going to know. You know, when I was in Georgia, I was actually at the State Department when Pluto got demoted, and you know it was a big deal. I mean, we had people calling. We had a reporter that kept calling saying, "Are you not going to send out a notice to all the teachers that say Pluto's no longer tested? We don't test Pluto. You don't make kids learn the planets in order." Well, that little, you know, outer 2 planet thing, I wasn't even going to go there. You know, and I had great quotes in that article, or in that interview, by the way. Fantastic. In fact, I thought I was going to, if there was Twitter back then, I would have been all over the place with great quotes. But as we were hanging up, he said, well, do you think that they're going to still use the solar system to do science fair projects? And I said, yeah, but now there are only 8 balls instead of 9. That was the only one that got in the article. So never be flippant with a reporter. So for NGSS, what's the difference? Well, in 1st grade, they're going to use observations of the sun, moon, and stars to describe patterns that can be predicted. So kids are going to start off by looking at the sky. Now, I hear some people say, oh, well, you can't do this because they can't go outside at night. Okay, fine. There are these new things called pictures that you can bring into class and say, look, this is what the sky looked like last night. We won't even go into the computer, right? In 5th grade, they're going to represent data in graphical displays to reveal patterns of data changes in length and direction of shadows, day and night, and seasonal appearance of some stars in the night sky. So again, still focused on patterns and looking for evidence on how that works. In middle school, they're going to develop and use a model of the Earth, Sun, Moon system to describe cyclic patterns of lunar phases, eclipses of the sun and the moon, and the seasons. The fact that we get an eclipse means that at some point the moon is going to be between the Earth and the sun. But yet we have 51% of our population, based on that survey, that couldn't tell you even a little bit of evidence about how we know that there's something that's spinning, right? So, science and engineering practices. This is a big deal. In middle school, you'll see that this is an example of one of the graphics in the appendices. I want to be really clear that the engineering here was not meant to be a new engineering class. It actually is about engineering design within the structure of the science course. It also should be a bridge to CTE, to allow people to do more. So here they define, develop solutions, and optimize. You'll find out in the session that on engineering here, the part that gets left out a lot is the iteration of engineering. It's not just I did it once, I did the egg drop, my egg broke, darn it. Maybe you ought to optimize. How can we improve this? The other part is we want to really focus on preparing students for college, career, and citizenship. I'm not going to read all that to you. I'm just going to tell you just very briefly. This was a big focus. There's the same definition that we use for math and English can't work here. We don't have prerequisites. We don't have college admission that are non, we don't have remedial courses, non-credit bearing coursework in science. And frankly, we've not had as much research in science around this. So there was a lot of work done during this time. Michigan sent a team of higher ed faculty to come and work at a couple of meetings with us to verify, is this really what kids need to know when they come to college or into careers? So, and then this work will continue to happen throughout time as we go. And finally, the NGSS are actually aligned with the Common Core State Standards. Many of you have seen this. This is actually a Venn diagram that comes from Kenji Hokuda's work out of Stanford University, where they took the science and engineering practices from the framework, the mathematical practices from Common Core, and the student profile from English language arts. And look at the incredible opportunity we have to teach a whole child instead of pieces of a child. Now, this doesn't mean that science becomes reading. I hear that every now and then. There are people who love to say, oh, well, they're just saying that, you know, because they use the same word of argument, they just mean the kids have to just read. That's silly. Argument is about evidence. Scientific evidence is empirical. Okay? So this whole idea that we're trying to make kids just read about science is nuts. There's actually a couple of appendices that you will find that actually talk about this alignment. For instance, here's actually an example of how you could teach about kinetic energy in an 8th grade math course. Talks about the difference between going 30 miles an hour and 40 miles an hour in an accident. It's a public service announcement. It actually shows kids that we actually do math in the real world. It's not just about the even numbers. I mean, it really is. I don't mean that bad. My math people don't get mad at me. I'm not slamming you because we do the same thing in science. What I'm saying is that there's actually practical reasons that we do science and math. We have the same thing for English language arts in this final iteration. So finally, Joe, good. I'm almost finished. So how could this look? Now, a lot of you are probably already, you grabbed your cards and said, what about assessment? Somebody over there did, because I heard the laugh. So here's the thing. We have a unique opportunity here. We don't know what the feds are going to do. We don't know if they're going to put money towards science assessment. Right now, it's not looking real positive. I mean, let's face it, they can't agree on anything. We don't know what the states are going to do. We have to wait and see how many states adopt before we actually see if there's going to be some type of consortium. The thing is, the state that adopts these standards is going to have to radically change their assessment system. I mean, because you can't pull practices apart from content. Okay, if you do, you're not testing the standards, which means when you go to peer review from the feds, you're not going to pass peer review. Okay, so there's going to have to be some work done. But because I'm an optimist, I just really always want to push people to remember we actually have an opportunity in science that math and English didn't have. We actually have an opportunity to build capacity around instruction first, preparing our students and our teachers and our administrators before the test comes. Because there's a way to do that. So what I'm going to show you just very quickly, this is an example of what a classroom assessment might look like. Now, it's not the greatest one. It's not been vetted. I'm sure somebody in the room is going to say how horrible it is, and that's okay. I did it with a math friend of mine, and actually, it's really out there, because in this example, you can actually get evidence that kids understand math and English in addition to science. Sorry about that. But it's actually possible. So I bundled these performances together. One's about the factors that affect carrying capacity in ecosystems. The second one is about that ecosystems maintain relatively consistent numbers, but changing conditions may result in a new ecosystem. That there are impacts of human activities on the environment. That we need to evaluate technical solutions that reduce impacts of human activities on natural systems, and that there's an engineering component here where we talk about prioritized criteria and trade-offs. So Now, let me tell you, this is not something you'll do at the end of a class. It's not something you'll even do at the end of a period. This may be something you do over the course of a full instructional unit. On June 1st, a fictitious, fast-growing species of algae. I had to add fictitious because somebody one time emailed me and asked me, what species of algae is that? Because I don't know of any that grow that fast. So I put fictitious. Is accidentally introduced into a lake in the city park. It starts to grow and cover the surface of the lake in such a way that the area covered by the algae doubles every day. If it continues to grow unabated, the lake will be totally covered and the fish in the lake will suffocate. At the rate it's growing, this will happen on June 30th. So the first question is, when will this be covered halfway? You go, well, that's not science. No, but it's specific for math, but if I'm actually a biologist who's having to evaluate this, I actually need to know that. That's actually an important thing. I showed this recently and somebody said, oh, they just took a math example and turned it into a science. Well, sort of, but actually in science, we do actually need math. I know it's a surprise. On June 26th, the pedestrian walks by the lake every day, and warns that the lake will be completely covered soon. Her friend just laughs. Why might her friend be skeptical of the warning? This is actually more of an English activity of building some evidence for this argument. On June 29th, the cleanup crew arrives at the lake and removes almost all the algae. When they are done, only 1% of the surface is covered by the algae. How well does this solve the problem? They include a description of criteria and trade-offs that account for the reliability and environmental impacts. Okay? Write an equation that represents the percentage of surface area of the lake. Fully explain the equation and justify your relationships. Using available data, construct an argument that supports or refutes the problem's claims that the fish will suffocate. You have to actually have a kid define suffocate, because algae are photosynthetic. Does suffocate mean without oxygen or too much? Or they're going to have to talk about those competitive relationships. And then, given the disturbance, design a solution to help maintain the stability of the ecosystem. Now, I'm not going to go through this because I'm running out of time, but when people see the architecture at first, they kind of freak a little bit. That's okay. We did this because we wanted you to have as much information as the writers did when they wrote. And actually, it's the beginning of a rubric. Down here at the bottom, this is actually where these things have been focused on that particular activity. This is where your rubric actually begins. Here's some examples of math, where you can actually prove that a student knows evidence of math, and the same thing for ELA. Now, this is my contact information. Feel free to write that down. Feel free to send me an email. Ask me any questions you have. But let me just before I concede the podium to Joe, let me just say one quick thing. Actually, a couple of quick things, sorry. First of all, let me just express my gratitude to Sue publicly for the fantastic job you've done in marshaling this through. And to Joe and to Melanie Cooper. Melanie, stand up for a second so everybody can see you. These two individuals worked their rear ends off as part of the writing team, and just have done an incredible job of being great advocates and friends in this whole process. And I just want to tell you how much I personally appreciate it. The last message I have that you'll hear a lot today is this. Have the courage to be patient. That's not something in education we're used to. We're used to hurry up and testing. Courage to be patient means that we need to be thoughtful, we need to be deliberate. As we're working with states, one of the things we really push is if you really want to make sure this does the right, do a good job with Common Core. That needs to be a focus. And have a deliberate plan for how this gets rolled in. You can't just expect teachers to wake up one day and do it. Okay? Administrators have to have a plan for how they see this happening in their class, in their schools. So, folks, I know change is hard, and this is certainly a big change. But have the courage to be patient. Work together. You're going to have all the support you ever wanted or needed from me and from my organization, or none, because it may be you say, we got this. But you've got an incredible group here. And MSU has pretty much become the mecca of science education in the country. So you've got a great opportunity here today. So thank you for all your hard work. Thank you for for your attention. I'll be around all day, happy to talk and answer questions. Joe?